So what is the consensus? Did he manage the tightrope between business and labour? And is this putting us on the right track for economic growth? Well, Professor Bonang Mohale is the president of Business Unity South Africa, and he joins us now. Prof, thanks as always for your time. A tough stance on government spending, no more bailouts as we heard for SOEs, sticking to spending targets, largely welcomed by the markets and the business sector. Prof, won't you just unmute your audio, please? Just press that unmute button.
We, as business, we absolutely support the posture that is absolutely positive. And I think he touched on all the right notes. But also the environment is actually quite supportive because there's now implementation of some economic reforms. SAA has been partially privatized. The municipalities can now secure and procure electricity from sources other than Eskom. And indeed, companies can now self-generate their own electricity up to 100 megawatts. And I think also he's sitting at a time when there's excess savings, driven mostly by the increased revenues. And these revenues are as a direct result of increased exports, mostly by agriculture and mining. But also we are benefiting from the commodity super cycle. Mining alone added about 94 billion of the 160 billion. And then, of course, lastly, we are also benefiting from the fact that there's been a marked improvement in labor productivity whilst containing inflation, even though we do that with 1.5 million less employees, which bodes well for the future, Annika.
Prof, one of the criticisms is that there was no announcement on an economic strategy to drive growth forward.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, for the first time, our reserves are building up quite nicely. We are no longer overly dependent on foreign direct investment only. It now needs to be fronted by domestic direct investment. There's now money for investment in infrastructure, but unfortunately we're not doing that purely and simply because we are not able to execute, we are not able to identify mega projects that we can deliver on target, on budget, and in full. This needs to be absolutely helped by the private sector. The construction industry is still absolutely decimated. There are a number of things that I think we still need to do. Number one, of course, we need to address the energy supply that has become sporadic and is the single both systemic and systematic risk, together with youth unemployment and 74.9%. When you have young people of military age sitting around and twiddling their thumbs with nothing to do, not only are you inviting trouble, you are actually actively agitating and orchestrating for it. The next ESCOM is definitely going to be Transnet, because when you look at their results, at the qualified audit, the loss that they've made, 8.4 billion, and the fact that Durban is actually the third from the bottom at the time that we needed to really get our goods to the rest of the world that absolutely needs it. The world actually suffers from huge global supply constraints at the time that even the global debt is actually at staggering levels. Here's an opportunity for South Africa to make its own mark. But unfortunately, when you speak to offshore investors and foreign direct analysts, they're absolutely brutal about South Africa's prospects. And they're telling us that actually capital now has a lot of competition. In fact, South Africa is underperforming almost all the emerging markets, Annika.
Prof, do we have the fiscal space to drive growth? I mean, some of these small and medium businesses really took a knock post-COVID, many forced to close down, yet there was little said on a business support program.
No, we don't have the fiscal space for a number of reasons, because 70% of what Edward Kieswetter collects from the South African Revenue Service, from you and I, Annika, it goes just to three buckets. Number one is this bloated public sector wage bill. Number 2 goes to servicing debt. The third, of course, goes to social security. The numbers don't add up. Pre-COVID, there were only 16 million of us that are gainfully employed. After COVID, we now know that we have lost 1.5 million jobs, and yet there are 17 million people on social security. When we said we are going to help with the 350 social relief, probably 16.5 million people applied, 13.5 million were seriously considered, 5.6 million were absolutely granted, which then increases the number of people on social security to 24 million, gobbling up 46% of our national GDP. So I think even though our debt to GDP ratio has improved somewhat at approaching 80%, this excludes guarantees to the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies. When you add those, our debt to GDP ratio is approaching 110%, and frankly, it's unaffordable. Annika?
Prof, in bullet points, what would you have liked to have seen in this maiden medium-term budget speech?
I think even though he's the Minister of Finance, to send a message that says South Africa is open for business. Number 1, to say we are on track to take the top state capture miscreants to jail. Number 2, that we are going to roll out the vaccine program as a matter of life and death, because you see, vaccine rollout has always been a race, because the country that can say we have defeated and therefore have rooted out this pandemic will then be able to reap up pent-up global tourism demand. For us, it matters because 10.2 million people visit our shores. We are put on the UK red list for all the wrong reasons. Thirdly, I think we need to reduce government debt. It's unaffordable. Lastly, I think we also need to address the stubbornly high levels of public sector wage bill. And of course, Annika, if I had time, I would say fix the more than 740 state-owned enterprises and state-owned companies, because they are becoming an albatross around our neck. And we need to focus on education, because remember, when you switch off the lights with Eskom, you lose almost 3 billion rand to the economy in terms of the GDP. You wipe off an entire percentage point. But the real tragedy is how we really failed our grade 12 learners who could not prepare and study and therefore write their first paper with the security and the assurance of electricity. In fact, their first paper they wrote in absolute darkness. This is the future pipeline. This is the future leadership, and yet we're not treating them with the agency that it deserves, Annika.
There, I would have to agree with you. Prof Mohale really let down for those matrics dealing with COVID, and then, of course, by Eskom having to write and unable to prepare in the dark. Thank you so much, as always, BUSA President, Professor Bonang Mohale.